No, not at all. Um,
Okay, before we start, Michael, with your permission, I would like to make 2 points, and I will try to be less verbose than usual. The first point I would like to make has to do with social media. You asked me yesterday about social media, and I think one of the reasons social media have been such a success is that they allow people to engage in what I call existential signaling.
mm,
Existential signaling is a fancy way of saying the need to be seen. Now,
mm,
the need to be seen is a survival issue. A baby, a newborn, which is not seen, who is not seen, is usually a dead baby in short order.
mhm,
You need to be seen by your mother or caretaker or caregiver to guarantee survival. So the need to be seen is very primordial, very atavistic, built into the machinery. It's hard baked. And in a world with 8.3 billion people, it's very difficult to be seen. It's increasingly more difficult. And so I think social media came to the rescue. And that's a way to be seen. The only problem
mm,
there is that you need to escalate your behavior in order to stand out from the crowd.
mm,
So social media drive escalatory behaviors. And but behind all this is, as I said, the need to be noticed, the need to be seen. Now, when we were peasants and when we used to inhabit villages, everyone knew everyone else's business. You were
mhm,
seen as a matter of course. But in urban settings, cities are actually the first virtual reality. Cities where the urban landscape is the first virtual reality. It's divorced from the land, divorced from the soil, and divorced from other people. So it's very difficult to be seen in such an environment. And that's where technology is leveraged and used by people in order to stand out, be noticed, be seen, be cared for, and and this creates very bad dynamics
mm,
among them escalation. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say is that I made a distinction yesterday between right-wing victimhood and left-wing victimhood. They're both grievance-based movements. Obviously, the right has different grievances to the left, but they're both grievances-based movements. But I think the solution is different and the focus is different. As I
mm,
said, as I alluded to yesterday, the left is a rumination movement, a rumination kind of. So they ruminate, they rehearse and they redigest and regurgitate
mm,
grievances, and they use grievances to establish a set of implicit rights which impose on everyone else corresponding obligations. And they do this via rumination, whereas the
mm,
right is more action oriented.
mm,
The right similarly has a set of grievances, but the right goes about it by dismantling institutions or building new institutions or, whatever the case may be.
mm,
Ironically, that's not always been the case. When you go back to, for example, FDR, Roosevelt, the New Deal was a very action-oriented
mhm,
program, and technically, at least, he was a Democrat. So something has happened to the Democratic Party and the left more generally. And I think what has happened is the influence of Europe. I think it's what I call the European infection.
mm,
Because in the 60s and 70s, people attempted to adopt action as the solution. You had in 1968, you had a series of revolutions across Europe, and they all failed miserably. And what has happened after that, intellectuals took over, and the whole thing became a debate society.
mm,
And there was endless rumination over decades, mainly French intellectuals, but not only. There was this endless rumination and rehashing and regurgitating and analysis and reanalysis and overthinking and
mhm,
overanalyzing and what have you. And it led nowhere.
mm,
There are no, if you look at the history of Europe, nothing has happened institutionally since the 80s. Absolutely
mm,
nothing. There's nothing new in Europe. I mean, except the euro maybe. But and so what happened, I think, is the left in the United States got infected, got caught the European malaise,
Mm.
and became a navel gazing
Mm-hmm.
kind of movement, navel gazing sphere or space.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the right is still out there, is still reality grounded in reality, is still maintains reality testing. And so the right is much more action oriented. Mind you, I disagree with the action. This is not an endorsement of the right, but they are definitely more action oriented than the left.
Mm.
What the left does is play Lego. I mean, the left plays with bricks, changing the order of the bricks, the color of the bricks, and so on and so forth. But there's no new game in town. There's
Mm-hmm.
no real. Ironically, it is the right which is revolutionary,
Mm-hmm.
whereas the left is reactionary in many
Mm-hmm.
ways. That's the irony. But okay, I don't want to go too deeply into this.
No, I love those. I love those observations. I was going to start on something different, but you've inspired me to let's go a little deeper on this question of history. I'm in the middle of a terrific biography of Goethe, the great German novelist, and his emergence in Germany. Is sort of the Germans, feel like they finally have somebody that's equal to Shakespeare. This is mid 18th century. And he and his colleagues are all sort of expressing a lot of sentimentality, a lot of emotion for the first time. It's very exciting and liberatory for the Germans to be so emotional and for those emotions to be valued. But everybody, it's just the elite, of course. The ordinary folks are just happy to be blacksmiths and farmers and whatnot. Well, now you kind of fast forward, 300 years. And now that sentimentality, that emotion, that constant self-expression is the norm. And then the even more extreme, expressions are valorized. At least in mainstream liberal culture, there's conservative culture which continues to look down upon that, which retains a stoic view of emotional regulation, whereas it seems like you had that first period, but then of course you have the 1960s, which is also valorizing a kind of, hyper expressiveness. That there's even like scream therapy. There's all these stories of Esalen in the 1960s. This is a sort of a therapeutic location in Central California. Um, and now you get to today, and it's just there's so much of that that's just so mediocre that you have to. I'm sort of when I'm reading the Goethe, I'm reminded of how beautiful and wonderful that emotionalism was. And now it's just awful, and you kind of end up with, the thing that we spoke with the first time, which is these, young people that are throwing soup on the Van Gogh painting. And it's just there's nothing interesting about it. Like even as a protest, it's almost like there's something quite beautiful about the white and black students in the 60s and 50s who sat at the soda counters and they had the soda poured on them as a real, but they were stoic. They were emotionally deeply regulated and disciplined. And now you just kind of get this gross, mediocre, uninteresting, expression. I find it very despairing. I find it like the quality of the culture I find is just the quality of pop culture is very low right now. There's just nothing, there's very few interesting films, very few little interesting television movies. The question I was going to start with had to do with the subjective nature of narcissism. Because it seems like, when we sort of, and I spent some time on the DSM versus the ICD descriptions of narcissism, because part of what we talked about yesterday is we said, is it really accurate to say that the kids that throw the soup on the Van Gogh paintings and the grandiosity of it, which is we're going to change the entire global energy economy by throwing the soup on the painting. And
You
then you
seem to
have,
be traumatized by this event.
what's that?
You seem to be traumatized by this event.
Yeah. Well, it's such a picture, isn't it?
Yeah.
Such a clear picture. And then on the other hand, you would have somebody like Elon Musk or Donald Trump who say, I'm going to transform global communications or I'm going to become a consequential president. You could say that those are grandiose statements. On the other hand, when they come true, on the one hand, so I guess the question was, is the difference like, are they both equally narcissistic? Are the kids that throw the soup on the Van Gogh paintings just the same kind of narcissism as Elon Musk and Donald Trump? Or is it different because Donald Trump and Elon Musk have actually realized the promises that they made? And to what extent does narcissism depend on a subjective judgment or evaluation of whether or not the person is equal to their grandiosity and entitlement?
Yeah, that's a superb question. Actually, I have a video where I'm simulating a therapy session with Van Gogh, Vincent van
Huh.
Gogh. And
Wow.
Vincent calls me because we're on a first name basis, of course. Vincent calls me and he says, I'm one of the greatest painters the world has ever seen. And I'm going
Mm,
to be much more remembered than Rembrandt and Michelangelo and what have you. And I tell him, Vincent, listen, these statements are really, the strong indicators of a pathology. You need help. You need
mm,
medication. You're a very sick
mm,
individual. Your
mm.
reality testing is impaired.
Right.
You're utterly delusional. And that's Vincent van Gogh. I mean, he was onto something, wasn't he? He did
Yeah.
become one of the most prominent painters in human history. So it's a great question. Where do we draw the
Mm,
line? How
yeah.
can we tell if certain claims are realistic or grounded in reality, or whether they are divorced from reality? But
Mm,
before I go there, because I would like to comment on
yeah.
something completely different,
Yep.
like the famous Monty Python sketch, and now for something completely different. So I'd like to comment on. I think we need to make a distinction between pathological narcissism and ostentation. The need to be seen, this existential signaling, the need to be noticed. That's what I said. It leads to escalatory behaviors. It leads to
Hmm.
escalation. Throwing
Hmm.
soup on a Van Gogh or doing something to the Mona Lisa or something also with the Mona Lisa.
Hmm. Yep.
These actions have a lot to do with the need to be noticed, with the need to be seen, with existential signaling, and with another phenomenon, virtue signaling. Virtue signaling is actually a way of fitting in, a way of belonging, a way of adhering to an in group and excluding an out group. So it's a the social aspect of existential signaling is virtue signaling, because virtue signaling is public facing and outward oriented, whereas existential signaling is about
Hmm.
yourself. The,
Hmm.
the feeling that you're not about to dissipate into thin air because you are being noticed, you are being seen. So ostentation is not narcissism. All narcissists are ostentatious, but only a tiny fraction of ostentatious people are narcissists.
Hmm.
And so this is an important distinction. Second thing I would like to comment on, and forgive me for straying far and
No,
wide,
please.
but I think we may be introducing this way some additional, aspects or dimensions. So the second thing I would like to quote the work of Campbell, the famous sociologist, who said that we have transitioned from the age of dignity to the age of victimhood.
Hmm.
Victimhood is now the organizing and explanatory hermeneutic principle, by and large, on right and left alike.
Hmm.
That's the way we see the world today. We're all victims or potential victims, and we're in search of abusers. Now, the thing is that someone's victim is someone else's abuser. That's not my observation. That is the observation of one of the most prominent scholars of abuse, Karpman, who came up with the Karpman drama triangle.
Hmm.
Karpman said that abusers, there are three roles. There is the abuser, there is a victim, and there is the rescuer. And all three of them rotate. The abuser sometimes becomes the victim becomes the abuser, the rescuer could become either, and does become either. So there's a constant rotation in the roles. This is what we're going through in the world today.
Mm,
If you're a victim, you need to find an abuser, and abusers are in short supply. So you're likely to cast the other as the abuser. You're likely
mm,
to use othering and alterity as a way to find your abuser. Everyone is searching for it. Everyone and his dog is a victim. I mean, that's the way it is today. So that's the
mm,
second observation. The third observation I'd like to make is that you can divide human history basically to three major periods using clinical psychology, of course.
mm,
The first one is the psychotic period. It's the period where people were psychotic. They believed in the existence of God, angels, demons, and what have you. This is a great definition and description of psychosis. So today, if someone comes to a therapist and says, I believe there's a demon talking to me constantly and so on and so forth, he's going to end up in an asylum, probably with a lot of medication. Whereas in the past, in the distant past, this kind of person would have become a prophet or would have established a new religion. So there was this psychotic period. Then, starting with the Renaissance and the cult of the individual, because the Renaissance, main feature of the Renaissance was the cult of the individual. Starting there, we had the age of Narcissism, and it lasted something like 400, 500 years, probably ended about 20 years ago, probably with a high-tech bust, boom and bust, Probably it ended then. And I believe that we've entered a third era, a third era in human history, and that would be the era of the borderline. I think we are in a borderline world
mm,
with emotional dysregulation,
mm,
hyper emotional displays, ostentation, fantasy, reliance on authoritarian father figures or mother figures, etc. These are all characteristics of the borderline. And I think we are living in the borderline age.
mm,
Now, Goethe was one of the precursors or the prophets of later age romanticism in Germany, which then spread to the United Kingdom. But at that time, it was the height of the narcissistic period. So a narcissist would not allow himself, or herself, of course, narcissist would not allow himself to express emotions in a way which could be misinterpreted
mm,
as vulnerability or weakness.
mhm,
A narcissist would express emotions in a way which renders the narcissist somehow strong, unique, outstanding, skilled, capable, and so on. So there was a period of instrumentalization of emotions.
mm,
For example, love became the standard for marriage. It's a completely revolutionary idea at the time. To this very day, in most countries in the world, most marriages are arranged marriages. I don't know if you know the statistics, but in India, 81% of marriages are arranged. There's no concept of love.
mm,
Love is a totally German invention, ironically. So, but love was instrumentalized, was leveraged. It wasn't love for its own sake, but love led to these relationship eruptions, one of them being and institutions such as
mm,
monogamous marriage. So when we transition to the borderline age, we transition from instrumentalized emotions, in other words, emotions that lead to action.
mhm,
Even when Goethe wrote the book about Werther, the young Werther, there was Weltschmerz, the sorrow of the world, and
mhm,
it led to suicide.
mhm,
There was like a pandemic of suicide among young people who've read the book because in that period emotions were prescriptive. They were prescriptive. They led you to act. So if you had, for example, emotions for the Greek Revolution, like Byron, you didn't just sit back and say, I'm going to protest in Columbia University, wrapped with the flag of Greece against the evil British.
mm,
That wasn't the idea. What you did, you pick up your things and you went to Greece to fight, which is what people did. So there was a lot of emotionality about the Greek conflict, which involved the Ottomans and the British, and don't ask. There was a lot of emotionality involved, very similar to the Gaza protests
Mm.
nowadays, but then it led to action. And I would say even in 1936, when in Spain you had the Spanish, Civil War, people came up from all over the world and joined the Republican government, fighting off the fascists. Emotions always led to action in the narcissistic age.
Mm.
And now we're in a borderline age where the expression of emotion is its own goal.
Mm.
That's the goal. The
Ugh.
goal is to be ostentatiously emotional. It's virtue signaling, it's existential signaling, it's about signaling. Signaling means no substance, all appearances. Signaling means no commitment. It's fleeting. Today, Gaza, tomorrow, Burma, or Russia,
Mhm.
Ukraine, whatever. As long as you have the ability to take a selfie, an emotional selfie, of course, with tears streaming down your face and what have you,
Mhm.
and so on. So there's a lot of ostentation, and I call it the borderline age.
Mm.
And now coming to your question, now that we are a lot older, both you and me, I'll try to tackle your question. It's again an excellent question. Having given the example of Vincent van Gogh in therapy, we can take a step back and say, was his grandiosity justified? Was his grandiosity actually a measure of his intact reality testing?
Mhm.
Did he know something we didn't know? Were we the
Mhm.
ones who were deluded by societal and cultural edicts? And, were we, for example, um, did we judge Van Gogh to be a poor painter because he hasn't sold paintings,
Mhm.
which is a capitalistic criterion?
Right.
So we were the ones who were deluded. We judged him by the amount of money he made when we should have judged him by different criteria. And so he was the one grounded in reality. When Elon Musk said, I'm going to take a man to Mars, or all of humanity, whatever is left of it, to Mars or whatever, when he said, I'm going to introduce commercial space travel, I'm going to do it much more cheaply than NASA. Was he being a megalomaniac? Was he divorced from reality? Was his reality testing impaired? Or did he know something about Elon Musk that we didn't know, that we had no access to? Did he have, in other words, privileged information?
Mm.
So the answer to your question is information asymmetry,
Mm.
imperfect information. The problem with psychology in general, clinical psychology and so on, and all treatment modalities is that we have imperfect information. As clinicians, as practitioners, we know a lot less about the patient than the patient knows about herself. And it is this imperfection that renders treatment modalities in psychology highly inefficient and also puts in doubt the very concept of diagnosis or
Mhm.
diagnosing. Because in physics, there is no information asymmetry. There's no imperfection of information. If you study neutrons and I study neutrons, we have the full information available at this moment, of course, but we have full access to the same set of data. We may differ in terms of interpretation, hypothesizing, theorizing, and so on, but the data is there, available to both you and me, and um, it is complete as far as the times go, and so on. Whereas in psychology, from the get-go, the therapist knows very little, and the patient knows a lot more about the patient, not in general.
Mhm.
So yes, it's very difficult to establish an objective test for narcissism. Only time will tell. The only objective test is history. So when someone makes grandiose megalomaniacal claims and so on and so forth, you have two options. You can diagnose them and say, these people are mentally ill. Or you can say, okay, let's wait and see. That has to do with claims about skills and accomplishments and so on. I call them
Mm.
external claims. However, when an individual makes claims about his or her internal world, there we do have more or less objective criteria.
Mm.
So if someone were to come and tell me, I'm a great painter, and in 100 years, I would be known as a great painter. Maybe. Let's wait 100 years and see. But if someone were to come and tell me there are demons whispering in my ear, and they're telling me to cut off my ear,
Mm.
well, that's a powerful indicator of a mental illness. Similarly with the narcissist. The narcissist can make external claims. I'm a genius, I'm amazing, I'm charismatic, I'm this and that. I'll take men to the moon and then to Mars. These are all external claims. And we have no way to verify, to establish veracity, the truth value, what Aristotle called the truth value. We have no way to establish the truth value of such claims. Aristotle said that the statements about the future have no truth value. They can't be proven true or false. You have to wait.
Hmm.
But if someone were to come to me and say, I'm going to be a great painter, I'm going to be the greatest painter ever, and also I want to cut off my ear, regarding the second statement, I can make a relatively objective or at least statistical analysis and say, this guy, something's wrong with this guy, he needs treatment, he needs help, he needs medication, he needs whatever. When it comes to Musk and Trump, which are the two people foremost on your mind probably, when it comes to Trump and Musk, we have a set of external statements, most of which have come true, actually. So clearly, their reality testing is not impaired when it comes to self-assessment, when it comes
Hmm.
to self-evaluation. But that is an artifact of the information asymmetry. I, as a clinician, I'm not a clinician, but if I were a clinician, I know a lot less about Elon Musk than Elon Musk knows about Elon Musk. So inevitably, his statements carry more weight,
Hmm.
ipso facto. However, both of them, especially Elon Musk, but also Donald Trump, have made a series of statements about their state of mind, states of mind, internal states, moods, emotions, cognitions, thousands of such statements. All you have to do is read Isaacson's biography of Musk. And these statements are mostly seriously pathologized, I regret to say. Seriously pathologized. And people say, oh, you envy them and so on and so forth. It's nothing to do with envy. The last person I would envy is Elon Musk. He's a miserable person. He's a very unhappy person. But the statements these two people made over several decades are indicative of severe mental health issues, which have nothing to do with their capacity. Yesterday, I explained to you that we make a distinction between what we call episodic, procedural, and semantic. So you could acquire skills, you could be a highly accomplished person, and so on and so forth, and at the same time be severely mentally ill. The man who wrote the first volume of the Oxford English Dictionary wrote it out of a mental asylum because he tried to kill his lover, and don't ask, he was seriously mentally deranged.
Mm.
So it doesn't mean much. There's good grounds to assume that Sigmund Freud was a very mentally unhealthy person. And Jung, of course, Jung was diagnosed with psychotic disorder, with psychosis, and spent time in an asylum.
Mm.
It's part of his biography. So this conflation and confusion between accomplishments and mental state is wrong. Even mentally ill people can be highly accomplished. Actually, I told you yesterday that scholars like Eysenck, psychologists like Eysenck, suggested that mental illness is a precondition for creativity and for accomplishments in life. That the more mentally ill you are, the more likely you are to be creative and even to succeed in life. It's not, this is a myth that mental illness incapacitates you. Mental illness makes you miserable, but it doesn't incapacitate you. There's no connection
Mm.
between these two things. And how do we decide whether to give someone treatment? Number one, are they unhappy? Do they have something called ego dystony? Do they feel bad with themselves, uncomfortable? Do they hate themselves? Do they loathe themselves? Do they self-defeat and self-destruct? What is their relationship with themselves? That's question number one. Question number two, are they functional in a variety of settings, not only in a single setting? For example, they may be great entrepreneurs, but they may suck when it comes to intimate relationships. Yeah. So are they functional in a variety of settings? If the answer to these two questions is yes, we do not intervene. You could have a psychotic person who believes that he is in touch with God through Napoleon, via Napoleon, and so on. And yet this person is perfectly happy-go-lucky and at the same time has a great relationship, is functional at work, is a multimillionaire, and he loves his children and they love him, and so on and so forth. Why would we intervene?
mm,
For example, I do not think that Donald Trump needs therapy. I see no indication that he needs therapy. He is totally
mm,
egocentric. He's absolutely elated with who he is.
mhm,
And he is super accomplished. Why would we intervene? However, Musk requires therapy. Definitely. He is an extremely profoundly unhappy person. Again, read the biography. Isaacson's
mm,
biography is a bit of a hagiography, but it's relatively objective, as much as he could maintain objectivity. And
mm,
it's on every page that this
mm,
man is devastatingly unhappy,
mm,
miserable, completely. I think he would benefit from therapy. Trump wouldn't. He would be wasting his money.
mm.
You know.
Can, can you say more about when you said that the both men are pathological, the statements they've made over years? Can you describe that a little bit more?
Donald Trump made thousands of statements, and I have a series of videos dedicated to his statements, actually,
Mm.
on my various YouTube channels. As I told you, also started granting interviews to American Thinker in 2016, where I analyzed many of his statements.
Mm.
There's even a video which is the outcome of analyzing 600 hours of video
Oh my gosh.
of Donald
Okay.
Trump. Yeah. So in that particular video, I'm going through the statements and so on. But generally speaking, Donald Trump has a view of interpersonal relationships, which is indicative of pretty extreme pathology. Um, and that includes problems with intimacy and the way he sees other people and so on and so forth. So this is one group of statements. I'm very reluctant to transform this into remote therapy or remote analysis of the men because I had hoped that we could tackle more broader topics. So, but one group has to do with interpersonal relationships. One group has to do with his view of the world as, for example, hostile, and so it's paranoid ideation and hypervigilance, which are very powerful indicators of pathology. Another group of has to do with conspiracism, not only the belief in conspiracy, specific conspiracy theories, which is okay. I mean, people can believe in conspiracy theories and still be mentally healthy, but the belief that the whole world, the organizing principle of the world is conspiracy. So nothing gets done or nothing happens except through a conspiracy of some kind, and that is already a pathology known as conspiracism, and so on. I can go, and I not only I can go on, but I have gone on. I mean, there are videos. Those of people who are interested
Mm.
can visit
Mm.
American Thinker and search for Vaknin Trump, or go on my Vaknin Musings channel, and there are analyses there. Not on my main channel, on my other channel and so on. But I've analyzed Trump much more than I've analyzed Musk because Isaacson did the work for me with Musk.
Mm.
And but on the other hand, I'm telling you, he doesn't need any help. He doesn't need any therapy. There's no call for intervention here. He's perfectly functional. He's happy with who he is. He has gone through life, accomplishing everything he's set to accomplish. He's grounded in reality when it comes to this aspect of his
Mm.
life. He's highly unrealistic, highly delusional when it comes to other aspects of life in general and his life in particular. But when it comes to accomplishing goals, he's goal-oriented, he's highly accomplished. So you're beginning to see the nuances. It's not
Mhm.
You can't just generalize and say anyone who's grandiose, anyone who's dysempathic or whatever is sick and needs therapy. That's not the way it is. You need
Mm.
to you need to be fine-tuned. You need to be pinpointed. You need to
Hmm.
it's these canvas statements about people, not all narcissists need therapy. Maybe even a small percentage, because narcissists are known to be egocentric. And you know what? Among narcissists, the percentage of accomplished people is much higher than in the general population, let alone psychopaths. The
Mm.
most accomplished group of people are psychopaths. Psychopaths are 20 times more represented among chief executive officers than the general population. That means the general population is one chief executive officer, psychopaths have 20. So they're highly accomplished
Mm.
and so on. And if we, so we're beginning to talk philosophy now. The menu, the good life. What is the good life? What is the appropriate life? We're beginning now to deviate and seamlessly, it's a slippery slope because you say, well, narcissists are accomplished, they're happy, psychopaths are accomplished and happy, why should we intervene? And they tell you, yeah, but it's a mental illness and they're hurting people and we should. But it's not really psychology, that's philosophy.
Hmm.
Or if you wish, sociological theory, or I don't know what label to give it. Psychology has to focus on the individual. Psychology has no place in social engineering.
Mm.
Psychology should not become a coercive social tool the way the left has leveraged it. The left has leveraged psychology this way.
Yeah, I mean, let's get into that a bit. I mean, our book is about the left, and the reason that your work became so influential for me is I was studying climate change. Um, what reduces carbon emissions? Two big things have been nuclear power and natural gas. You move from coal to natural gas, you reduce carbon emissions by half. You move to nuclear, you eliminate them. Those are the technologies that climate activists are most opposed to. So that's your first clue. It has nothing to do with reducing carbon emissions because if it did, you wouldn't be attacking the two main ways of reducing carbon emissions. Instead, they want to do all sorts of other things. They want to just make energy scarce and expensive. They make clear they want a Malthusian, view of society, and that's been what they pursue for 60 years. Fast forward, and so you have a climate movement that in some ways behaves like a conventional social movement with protests and whatever. Well, then you get fast forward to 2022, and we start seeing behaviors that I can't explain. Throwing the soup on the Van Gogh paintings, pouring milk onto the floor, they glue their hands to the floor. In many ways, these appear to be behaviors of toddlers, of tantrums. The public hates this. The public rejects this. It makes, when they stop traffic, you can see the drivers, sometimes usually a man will get out of the car and try to drag the protesters away. You could tell it's everything that he can do to not physically assault the protesters. The public hates this. So it's irrational through and through, from their goals to the strategies, tactics. Your theory says, look, this is a kind of narcissism. It's you see the sort of the grandiosity, the entitlement, the emotional dysregulation, the wealthiest children in the world claiming that they're going to live in an apocalyptic society where there's nothing in the IPCC that says that there will be anything close to apocalypse. You're talking about reducing GDP a bit more from a projected larger GDP. It's so your theory is becomes very helpful. At the same time, we know that there's a problem. You don't want to diagnose any individual. So we say, okay, fine. Nietzsche says madness is rare in individuals, but it's the rule in groups. And we start to kind of go down the list and we start to see a bunch of different cases on race, on transgenderism. I mean, on trans, I mean, all of them have a kind of psychosis, a sort of a mass psychosis, a kind of delusion. In the case of trans, it's this idea that you can become the opposite sex or the opposite gender. And even on the difference between sex and gender, they don't use the same words consistently over time. So the language you start to feel crazy just trying to understand what's happening. So I guess my interest in reaching out again was to get your sense of, yeah, what's happening with these movements. You start with some really beautiful moments. Martin Luther King says, "My vision is black and white children together." Now, he also says there's a debt that white people owe to black people. And so both things are present in the movement. And over time, the picture of just the black and white children holding hands was the picture. That starts to not only go away, but actually becomes coded as a racist vision because why would you dare imagine that black and white children should be able to hold hands after everything that happens? The most important thing is the debt. And so the what comes to the fore out of the beautiful parts of the left is a kind of, just for lack of a better word, it looks like a psychopathology. It's characterized by impaired reality testing, delusion, mass psychosis, behaviors consistent with narcissism. The other picture I love is this picture you may remember during the Black Lives Matter protest. There were a bunch of young people demanding that a woman who was at a cafe that they demanded that she raise her fist. So they basically have these people holding their fists over this woman, and she said later that she supported Black Lives Matter, but she refused to raise her fist. Those kids that were doing that were behaving like psychopaths. But probably in their day-to-day lives are not psychopaths. They're actually probably the opposite. They're probably very sensitive and very empathic, and that's part of the characteristic we see in extreme radical movements. Even terrorist movements are often people that were very, very sensitive to the plight of the downtrodden. So Sam, we're trying to make sense of this transformation, and when you in the tools of analysis uh, don't work anymore because the behaviors are irrational through and through to the point of being self-destructive. That the public finally says, we're so afraid of the left. We're so terrified of the left, rioting, burning, genital mutilation of children, racist hiring practices, open border, homelessness everywhere, crime, that they go and elect Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump's success is it's impossible. They try to arrest the political candidate. They try to put the political candidate, and there's censorship and so. So there's a way in which the Donald Trump is not possible without the left becoming so self-destructive. So that's just some context for you to say we look around for tools just to make sense of reality, and the tools that most explain what's happening are psychological tools, but then they come with some sense of danger that we don't want to engage in diagnosis. We know that there's a moral judgment. Like if I say these behaviors are narcissistic, I know I'm making a judgment. I'm saying
But
that it's
that's wrong.
bad to throw.
But that's precisely what's wrong with clinical psychology. The fact that narcissism has transitioned from diagnosis, clinical entity, to a value judgment. Precisely what's wrong. Precisely how I ended my previous answer. That
Yeah.
is not the role of clinical psychology, social engineering, social institutions, impact on society, and so on. That clinical psychology had become relational rather than individual is the big corruption of clinical psychology
Mm,
because it became politicized in effect.
right.
When you exclude groups of people, you engage in othering, alterity, and so on. When you exclude groups of people by saying, they're harmful, they're dangerous, they're this, they're that, what you're engaging in is politics. By any
Yeah.
other name, that's politics. So if you say psychopaths are dangerous, they're harmful to people, they're criminals, they're What does any of this have to do with psychology?
Mm.
These may be legitimate concerns and legitimate arguments. We have to review the statistics and see. Because for every psychopath who's a criminal, by the way, there are like 10 psychopaths who are surgeons and another 100 who are chief executive officers. So, mind
Hmm.
you, even this statement in the DSM is counterfactual.
Mm.
But it has nothing to do with clinical psychology. The DSM has been definitely weaponized and politicized, no question about it. The
Mm.
same way that it had happened in Soviet Russia, in Soviet Union, where
Hmm.
people were diagnosed by state psychiatrists, sent to mental institutions just because they were dissenters. Dissent was mental illness because you wouldn't dissent. It's self-destructive,
Right.
wouldn't you? Look at Navalny. Wasn't he suicidal? This Navalny? Wouldn't he
Right.
have been better on medication or something? So the minute, the minute you weaponize, the minute you allow psychology to serve as a tool for social realignment, social power, resettling social power asymmetries, influencing the formation of institutions and the contents, ideology, that moment you've lost any claim to science. That
Mm.
moment, you're not even a
Right.
pseudoscience anymore. You're just a political party, the political
Right.
party of the mentally healthy, if you wish, whatever that may mean. Even that is debatable. As to your as to your question, as I see it, wasn't a question actually. You made a thesis. So as I see it, I would like to inject a few
No,
more
please.
elements with your permission. The first thing is something which was first described by Sander, Sander, in 1989. He was a psychoanalyst. And he came up with the concept of shared fantasy. The shared fantasy in the studies of narcissism, my contribution, I introduced it to the study of narcissism. The shared fantasy is when the narcissist establishes a narrative, and the narrative is reified, usually in a physical space. So a household, a church, a pub, a classroom, a political party. So there's always a real world manifestation of the shared fantasy, but behind it all, there's a narrative. And the narrative caters to the psychological needs of the narcissist. So the narrative aggrandizes the narcissist. The narrative isolates the narcissist, firewalls the narcissist from countervailing information and data from reality. So that they and so on. So this is the shared fantasy. I think many of the phenomena you describe are shared fantasies, simply shared fantasies. There is a group of activists or prominent intellectuals and so on and so forth. They spin a narrative. The narrative could be factual or counterfactual. Some elements in the Black Lives Matter movement were pretty factual. There is a bias in the police forces against blacks. I don't think that's much debatable, in my view at least. But many of the other elements are not factual. And the question is not whether they are factual or not factual. The question is whether they fit the narrative. In other words, the exclusionary principle is whether a statement or a proposition fits the narrative, not whether it corresponds to reality. That's a great definition of what Arendt called totalitarianism. So it's a totalitarian approach. The shared fantasy is always totalitarian.
Hmm.
And I think all these are shared fantasies. Perhaps the greatest shared fantasy is the idea of nature. What is nature? I don't think we can define nature or life or consciousness, all these, but nature, in my view, is a totally fantastic concept. Fantasy grounded in fantasy. First of all, it assumes there is nature and there is humanity, as if humanity is outside nature. It's a Cartesian view of observer and observed, like we are the observers. We are a disinterested party. There's humanity and there's nature. We observe nature. And when we interact with nature, we are we create adverse consequences. We are a negative agent. Our interactions with nature are detrimental and deleterious. But of course, it's unmitigated nonsense. We're an integral part of nature. Whatever we do is utterly natural. This laptop is completely natural phenomenon. So this distinction is fantastic. Nature is a fantasy, complete fantasy. There's no basis in anything, let alone anything scientific. So it's a fantasy. And then this fantasy, superimposed on the fantasy, there's a narrative. And the narrative is we are bad, nature is good. So there is a splitting defense mechanism. Splitting is an infantile defense where something is all good or someone is all good and something or someone is all bad. Black and white, right and wrong, but totally right and like totally wrong. Nothing mitigated, nothing, it's all complete. So we call it splitting and it should stop by age 2. So after age 2, you're not supposed to split. And if you split after age 2, something's wrong with you. You're a narcissist, maybe. So environmentalists and so on and so forth engage in splitting. Nature is all good, humanity is all bad. And what we have with nature is an abusive relationship. It's the paradigm of abusive relationship. And the idea, and it's exactly the Karpman drama triangle, because the environmentalists are the rescuers. Remember, in the triangle, you have abuser, humanity, not all humanity, capitalists, industrialists, consumers, white, rich, males, and so on. So there's a lot of intersectionality. Yeah? Okay, so there are the predators, the abusers. There's nature, who is the hapless sleeping beauty, the virgin, the damsel in distress. And there is a rescuer. The rescuer are the environmentalists. But remember what Karpman said? That every abuser becomes a victim. Every victim becomes an abuser. And every rescuer ends up being either. The roles are fluid. We constantly cycle. So it's natural for the environmentalists who cast themselves as rescuers, natural for them to become abusers, according to Karpman's theory. And that's exactly what's happening. In a shared fantasy, the roles are fluid. Very often, for example, a narcissist would have a shared fantasy with an intimate partner. In due time, the intimate partner would adopt abusive behaviors. That is a fact. In all shared fantasies with narcissists, the intimate partner ends up being highly narcissistic and psychopathic, highly abusive, highly aggressive. This is a fact, well established. So that's exactly what happens here. So I would like to introduce the concept of shared fantasy in the Karpman drama triangle. I think that would be very useful to elucidate. I have one more thing to add with your permission. Can you remember? Can you remember your
Oh
question?
yeah, of
Okay.
course.
I'm older than you, so if I don't talk, I will forget. The next thing I would like to introduce, the last thing I'd like to introduce, I have many more things to say, but okay, let's stick to these, is scientism or pseudoscience. So what happens in all these situations, you mentioned transgender, you mentioned this, there is a kernel, there is an element of science that is then leveraged, exaggerated beyond recognition. So you start with gender dysphoria, which is as rare as unicorns, more or less. It's a very rare phenomenon. You start with gender dysphoria, and then you generalize it, you apply it indiscriminately, you politicize it, you leverage it as a victimhood movement, so there is ultimately buried somewhere there is the pearl under the princess, with the mattresses. There is something. Similarly with environmentalism, there are some scientific facts regarding greenhouse gases and climate change and so on. But then these few scientific facts are taken out of context, politicized, leveraged, photoshopped, and it's beyond recognition. So this is a form of, on the one hand, scientism, the religion of science, the unbridled misconception of science, because science is about doubt. Science is about getting things wrong, not right. In science, we are happy when we get things wrong. We are very suspicious and very uncomfortable when we think we got something right.
Mm,
So today in physics, for example, everyone is very uncomfortable with quantum mechanics and with relativity theories. Why? Because they work, and we are unhappy with this. We know that this is not the truth. Science
mm,
is asymptotic. It's an approximation to the truth. So when you take something like gender dysphoria and leverage and generalize it, you're not engaging in science, you're engaging in scientism. The admiration of a fake perception of science, of a wrong perception of science. It's as if science has all the answers when actually science is exclusively about asking the right questions.
mm.
This is scientism. And on the other hand, there is pseudoscience. There's pseudoscience. So they take these things, they take them out of context, and they get them wrong. They simply get them wrong. By the way, part of my biography, which I believe you're not acquainted with, I've spent about 10 years studying climate change. I've written numerous articles on the topic and so on. And at some point, I was even inducted into CFACT. I don't know if you know
Oh,
the,
sure.
yeah, I was inducted as a member of the scientific advisory committee and so on. So I had some, and I worked with The Economist on the magazine. I worked on climate change. So I a bit acquainted to some extent with climate change science and so on as it was about 10 years ago. So I was privy to all these dynamics, especially psychological dynamics among these people. And I make a clear distinction between the scientists and the political activists or the activists. Clear distinction. Most of the scientists I came across are okay. They're modest, they're humble, they are inquisitive, they're open to doubt and they falsify their own findings and they admit to errors and mistakes. They're okay. Most of them. There are a few megalomaniacs, but most of them are okay. Whereas among the activists, definitely you're right. There is a pathology there at play. But there are these elements on top of it. The scientism and the fantasy, the shared fantasy, and the Karpman drama
Yeah.
triangle, and the victimhood narrative, and so on. Here, the victim is the planet. This is a victimhood movement with an object as a victim, the planet. And so they are the rescuer. They're the rescuers. They're the saviors. We have this dynamic in abusive relationships where you have this guy, this guy who always finds women in distressed marriages and saves them and rescues them from the abusive husband. We have this dynamic.
Mm.
It's the same here, as I see.
In terms of this is very helpful, Sam, and inspiring a few more questions. I mean, in terms of sort of shared fantasies, I'm curious whether you view that as always a negative, because I think you would say the people that created the United States of America, and next year we'll celebrate the 250th anniversary of that story, and the story went, you know, that all humans are endowed by their creator. And they said, you can decide for yourself who that creator is. You can say God or nature, it doesn't matter. They're just saying all humans are endowed with inalienable rights, say natural rights, that entitle them to citizenship and voting and property and all these other things, to a particular form of governance and society and life. Um, well, I mean, obviously, that's not true in the sense that you go back to the ancients, or most of human history, and you have slavery, and you have huge numbers of people who clearly don't have those rights. Now, they would say, well, those rights are being deprived. They had them, but they were being deprived by oppressive people. But there is a bit of it seems like in that you could say that's a fantasy or it's a delusion to think that all humans are endowed with this. It's a story. There's even a kind of confusion between the is-ought distinction. They're really saying all humans should be treated as though they have these natural inalienable rights. But they say, no, the language is that they have these inalienable rights, but it's a shared. I guess my question is, would you call that a shared fantasy? No.
No.
What would you call that? What's the difference? So fantasy is purely
I'll
something
try to
you're
explain it
putting a
simply, but
subjective
it's most
value to.
definitely not a fantasy, and it's a great
Okay.
example. It's not a fantasy, it's a vision. A vision. A vision can be counterfactual. Actually, all good visions are counterfactual. All visions that stand a chance are counterfactual. If you have a factual vision, you're an engineer, not a visionary. Engineers have factual visions. For example, the engineers who built the Suez Canal, the engineers who built Apollo, they had factual visions. But these are blueprints. These are engineering blueprints, you know? When you have a counterfactual vision, only then do you possess transformative power and a chance to change something. Very often you fail. So many transformative visions or counterfactual visions remain counterfactual, but they still induce change. I am hard pressed to think of a counterfactual vision that did not induce change. The change may have sputtered, or the change may have been minimal, or the change may have reversed itself and there were reactionary forces at play, and you name it, or the change may lead to Auschwitz. I mean, there are counterfactual visions that are very dangerous and so on, but they always lead to change.
Hmm.
I think this is the test. A fantasy is static and self-preserving. A fantasy is opposed to change. A fantasy has a narrative. It's a take it or leave it. It's this is the way it is. It's usually self-aggrandizing and so on, but whatever the narrative may be, it is not open-ended. You want to talk about a fantasy? Religion is a fantasy. That's a fantasy because it fulfills all these criteria. Really, there is a canonical set of texts. They are open to interpretation and so on, but the rules of interpretation are rigid. There is no allowance for thinking outside the box, or this is frowned upon. In times past, you could have been burned at the stake or whatever, you know? So it's a highly rigid system of thinking. And rigid systems of thinking are usually fantastic, not always, but usually fantastic. Many visions start off as visions and end up as fantasies. A prime example is communism. Communism started off as a vision and ended up as a fantasy. That's why it collapsed. The second test for a fantasy, so the first test is rigidity, the opposite of change, hatred and rejection of change, warning against change, regarding change as deleterious, as undermining, as dangerous, as hateful, and change is the enemy, and so on and so forth. And you could see that even in morality plays, good versus evil, medieval morality plays, or earlier, where actually the active agents are satanic. It was the serpent in the Garden of Eden who initiated change. When God placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, God expected an inertial system that would never change. He warned Adam and Eve against change. God himself warned them against change. It was the serpent who introduced change into the equation. So change was equated with the devil, with the song. And it was the devil who rebelled against God. He was an archangel. He rebelled against God, and he's a fallen angel. The devil was a revolutionary. He tried to revolutionize the institutions. He tried to drain the swamp as far as he thought God was doing a bad job. And that God was being inegalitarian, that God was being totalitarian and authoritarian and a dictator and so on. There was a rebellion there. There was a revolution. So change is associated in fantasy with negativity. Change is always negative in fantasy. That's the first test. And the second test, fantasy always fails. I cannot think of a single case where fantasy had succeeded. It always fails for the simple reason that fantasy is the opposite of reality, is divorced from reality. It's not grounded in reality, it rejects reality. So you can't operate in reality. That's your platform, that's your framework. You can operate in reality by negating it and pretending that it doesn't exist or rejecting it, because then you will fail. Reality will impose cost on being immersed in a fantasy. And these are the two tests. By these tests, the founding fathers were not engaged in fantasy at all. They aspired to change. They integrated change into the system. The system was about change. By the way, it was a victimhood movement. If you read the founding documents, they are full of grievances against the crown in Britain and against this and against that. It's a victimhood movement. But they aspired to change, and one could say that it was a major success, all in all. If it had it been a fantasy, you would not have been celebrating 250 years anniversary. Trust me. Exactly like the USSR. The USSR they have transitioned from vision to fantasy, and that was the end of the USSR. Why? Because they kept lying to themselves about production figures, about,
Hmm.
it was a fantasy. They rejected reality. I'm done. I know it's shocking, but I'm done.
No, it's interesting. I mean, it sounds like the distinction for you between vision and fantasy is that the vision is grounded in some reality, is grounded in a greater sense of reality in terms of
Not
human
always, no.
nature.
No, I see that I have miscommunicated. Not always, no. The vision can be completely counterfactual, but the main goal of the vision is to induce change. Whereas the main goal of the fantasy is to preserve power structures, or to preserve some institution, some order. Fantasy is about preservation. Vision is about transformation. Both of them can be counterfactual. Both of them can be divorced from reality. But when you induce change and that vision is translated into reality, that's when it becomes grounded and it loses its visionary power. It becomes an agenda or a platform, political platform, or whatever. This is the transitional phase where the Soviet Union has failed. They had a vision. The vision was counterfactual because that's not the way economies work. The economic part of it was completely infantile. You know, it was counterfactual, but the vision was based on inducing change, changing the power asymmetry between in the feudal system that Russia was in the industrial societies and so on. But then what happened in the USSR, owing mainly to Stalin, who was mentally ill, severely mentally ill person, there was a transition from vision to fantasy. Stalin placed a premium on preserving on lies. There was a premium on lying. He incentivized people to lie. The whole system became floating in space, totally divorced from reality and so on. It became a fantasy. And then it proceeded to Brezhnev and so on, and finally it collapsed. When Gorbachev tried to introduce some elements of reality, the fantasy couldn't withstand it. The change was rejected. There was a military coup and so on and so forth. He lost his position, and that was the end of it. And Putin reinstated, actually, the fantasy. Russia now is totally fantasy based. I should know, I've lived there for 5 years right now. And it's totally fantasy based. It has no leg to stand on. It will collapse. I know it sounds bizarre right now, but fantasies always end badly. No exception in human history. Ask
Mm,
Adolf Hitler.
mm. I mean, it's interesting because I mean, it still sounds like let's take a look at let's look at the trans issue for a second. Um, there's part of the history comes from, exaggerating the prevalence of gender dysphoria and then mistreating it. Um, and but the discourse is so confused, Sam. they say someone will come in and they say, I feel like I'm a girl or I feel like I'm a boy, the opposite sex. And they say, yeah, you have a gender identity that's different from your sex, and this gender identity exists. It exists somewhere, maybe in the brain, but there's an existence to it. So we're going to realign the sex of the body or the sex traits of the body with that gender identity. So you look like you're a 15-year-old girl, but you've got a male gender identity. We're going to change your body so that you look like a male, and we're going to align your body with your gender identity. Then it goes horribly wrong.
Yeah.
We were leaked the internal files of this thing called WPATH, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. We were given the internal files. And one of the most fascinating parts of it was people come back to their doctors and they go, I've made a terrible mistake. I wasn't actually a boy. I was just confused and depressed, and I'm autistic, or the vice versa. And the response from the clinicians is to say, um, well, that's okay because you're on a gender journey. So
Mhm.
now you're going to be, maybe you won't be male or female at all. Maybe you'll be both male or female. It's shocking how flexible they were. They had this fantasy, but they weren't trying to enforce it. As soon as they said you have a gender identity as a male, and then they say I really was wrong about that. They say that's okay. You can be whatever you want to be. Does that contradict your view of the fantasy as trying to impose a kind of rigidity? In other words, they weren't trying to. They could have said, um, you're a terrible person because you are actually still a boy, but now you're just confused. They were very flexible because, of course, then they got to use more of their medical tools. They could say, well, we'll just do a little bit more testosterone, a little bit more estrogen. We're shocked when we look at these cases how flexible people are about the fantasy. You could say a similar story on race. As soon as you get, particularly the black conservatives, black critics of Black Lives Matter. So on the one hand, they say it's your lived experience that matters. But then a black person says, oh, I came out of the ghetto and I made a better life for myself by not being a victim and not engaged in this grievance and not engaged in racism. And I'm better for it. And they just say you're a sellout, to the true black cause. So it's sort of incredible levels of flexibility. And I'm sure we would find the same thing with how the communists interpreted Marx. They would
Mhm.
just choose the Marx that they wanted.
I don't think it denotes flexibility. I think it denotes rigidity. The fantasy,
Mm.
the fantasy, as I said, is a narrative. The narratives is replete with a codex. So the narrative includes a series of do's and don'ts, shoulds and oughts, things that are frowned upon and things that are commendable or even required, and so on.
Mm.
And the rigidity is in the codex. So um, the fantasy seeks to preserve the narrative. The vision is always open because if the vision is not open, it becomes a fantasy and it's no chance to succeed. You could see the whole thing as a Darwinian um, selection, kind of survival of the fittest. A vision that becomes a fantasy dies out, whereas a vision that is open to input from reality is very flexible, adaptive, changes here and there, and so on and so forth. There's a chance to survive. Whereas the vision of the United States has, in my opinion, until recently, never become a fantasy because people in the United States are very pragmatic and practical, and they go with the flow and they fake it till they make it, and all this ethos of capitalist entrepreneur capitalism, entrepreneurship, and market economy, and so on and so forth. The vision in Russia degenerated into a fantasy and lost out. So in the Darwinian selection, USSR died out, and America survived. Um, Fantasies preserve the narrative. The core protective mechanism and task of the fantasy is to preserve the storyline and the behavioral edicts or tenets that emerge from the story. So if the story, for example, is gender, and ironically, the transgender story is a very traditionalist, conservative, reactionary story. Ironically, because what does the transgender movement say? They say there should be a conformity between sex and gender, which is essentially a highly conservative statement. It's a Victorian statement.
Right.
And they say where there's no conformity, we should use medical means to induce this conformity. So where someone, for example, has one set of genitalia but feels like the opposite gender, we should operate on this kind of person or medicate this kind of person to make the gender and the sex match, which, mind you, is a super conservative, highly Victorian traditionalist approach to sexuality. That's the
Right.
huge irony of transgender. They're trying
Right.
to homogenize people. They're not for diversity. They're the exact opposite of diversity. They say if you are dysphoric about your gender, we're gonna we're gonna attack your body. We're gonna change your body because we don't allow heterogeneity. We don't allow heterogeneity. Everyone must be homogeneous. That's an amazing aspect of transgender that is totally been completely ignored. There's exactly the opposite perception of transgender, that it is a revolutionary thing and a progressive thing. And while in effect, they're highly totalitarian, it's a horrible thing, not because of the actual medical procedures, but it's a horrible thing because of the philosophy. The philosophy is we do not allow discrepancies. We do not allow variability. We do not allow, diversity. We don't allow. Where there is a gap opening, we're going to close it by all means possible. So,
But then, Sam, how do you then explain how the trans medical providers respond to these detransitioners? In other words, the girl comes back,
yeah, I know.
she's yeah, you know. And she goes, I made a terrible mistake. I removed my breasts. I did genital surgery. I've been taking testosterone, but I'm wrong. I was wrong. I'm actually, I was a girl the whole time. And the medical providers go, that's great. You're on a gender journey. So now we just need to, you can just add new breasts. It's true you won't be able to nurse a baby with them. And we'll change whatever we change down there. And yeah, we'll move you from testosterone to estrogen. And it's true, your voice will stay low and gravelly. But you're on a journey and it's okay. How do you explain, like, that's not, that they're just, they're very flexible. They're
Not
not
flexibility.
saying,
It's not flexibility, it's rigidity. That's what I'm saying. Transgenderism masquerades as flexibility, while essentially it's rigidly Victorian. The
then
transgender,
how do you explain that? But then how does that, if they're so rigid, then why are they willing to say, okay, now we aligned, we made you a boy, you were a boy for 5 years, and now you want to be a girl
because
again. Oh,
again, the discrepancy must not be allowed to stand. No
and
discrepancy.
the gender identity then, but then the whole concept that there's some fixed gender identity is not something that they actually believed.
No, that's a prevailing view. That's a mainstream view in academia. The belief is that gender, as distinct from sex, gender is a performative social construct and therefore is in flux. In principle, is in flux. There's quite a lot of supporting evidence of this. There are societies where a person can choose gender. For example, in northern Albania, a woman can choose to become a man subject to specific circumstances, like if there are no males in the family. So she can choose to become a man from that second, from the moment she announces herself to be a man. It's an announcement, public
Hmm.
announcement. I'm a man. From that moment, that woman is allowed to sit in a cafe, smoke with her peers, male peers, which in northern Albania is considered to be a no-no for a woman, and so on and so forth. There are other cases that demonstrate that gender is a performative social construct and therefore in flux. The rigidity of the transgender narrative is whenever there's a gap opening between gender self-perception and sexual equipment, we are going to close this gap.
Hmm.
Whether this gap is this way, and this gap can open several times during a lifetime. Like when you're 14, you feel like a girl. 19, you feel like a boy. Theoretically, at age 36, you can feel like a girl again. And we'll continue to
I
operate
see.
on you. We continue to operate on you as often and as long as needed, just in
Hmm.
order to avoid gender dysphoria, to avoid this discrepancy. They're
Right.
terrified of the discrepancy.
Right.
They're terrified of this.
That's interesting. Oh, now, Sam, let's take the lived experience example. So you hear white people can never understand black people because black people have this um, lived experience, and and they're burdened even genetically, they say, with trauma. And then you get a black conservative, or they could be a black liberal, but they sort of say, well, my lived experience leads me to think that I'm not a victim, and that in fact it's harmful to imagine that you're a victim, and that in fact you're victimizing people, you, Black Lives Matter, or NAACP, or whoever it might be. And then they say, okay, forget what we said about lived experience. Um, you're a traitor to the cause. You're just a sellout. How do you explain? Uh, doesn't that demonstrate a significant amount of flexibility?
No, where's the flexibility here? This is religious rigidity. You're a heretic if you don't adhere to the lived experience or lived life narrative. You are a heretic.
That's why they say you ain't black, right? That's what they say,
Yeah,
you're not
you're a
black then.
heretic.
Right,
So you should be burned at the stake, proverbial stake, hopefully. You should be burned
right.
at the stake. There's a rigidity for you. These are religions.
Hmm.
These are
Mm,
pseudo-religions or secular religions.
mm,
These are victimhood religions,
hmm.
victimhood sects. I mean, cults. They're cults by definition. And this whole argument of lived experience
Mm.
is, of course, beyond ridiculous. There is a subdiscipline in philosophy, and it's known as intersubjectivity studies. There is a question here. For example, how do I know that you're a human being? I don't. The answer is I don't. I have to rely on your self-reporting, and I have to make certain assumptions which are highly speculative in nature. That because you blink your eyes and you move your head in a specific way and so on and so forth, and I do the same from time to time, it stands to reason that you're a human being.
Mm.
It's highly speculative. So we have no valid, objective way to prove that another thing, another entity, is human. And what we do instead, we impose a speculative framework, a theory. We theorize, we hypothesize, actually. We create a hypothesis about each other whenever we come across each other. That's problem number one. Problem number two, I can never ever access your mind, and you can never ever access my mind. So how do we cope with this? Language. We self-report, body language, facial micro expressions and expressions. I mean, we gather cues, a lot of cues, big part of which is self-reporting by the other person, self-reporting by the, and we put them together, and again we create a theory. It's called a theory of mind. Again, we create a theory about the fact that the other person has a mind at all. Even then, we have no reliable access to another person's mind. And that has nothing to do with skin color. That's the idiocy of all this. It's nothing to do with skin color. It's perfectly applicable between the two of us. And as far as I see, we are not that black. So In principle, everyone's lived experience is idiosyncratic, inaccessible, non-communicable. In other words, the only correct frame of reference philosophically is solipsism, to imply that by observing other people's experiences, we can make valid deductions about their state of mind, their psychology, is completely erroneous. It's actually the first thing we teach in clinical psychology. Do not rely on your observations.
Mm.
Do not. You're as likely to be wrong as you are to be right. So
And rely instead on what? Self-reports?
we actually don't. It's an interesting thing. We don't rely on self-reports because a patient could lie or whatever. We ask ourselves, why did the patient choose these specific words? So a patient would come and say, my mother abused me. I'm not going to say, oh, I believe you, your mother abused you. Now let's build on this. Let's take this as the hypothetical, as a basis for treatment. I'm going to ask myself, why did he choose to tell me this? And why did he
Mm.
choose the word abuse?
Mm.
And why did he choose to focus on his mother? And so on. So I'm asking why, not what.
Mm.
It is that bad because nothing that comes out of you has any validity, scientific validity, of course.
Mm.
And if I were to observe you for the next 10 years, I would not learn much about you. I may learn a lot about your habits, about your preferences, eyeglass preferences, which are interesting. And so, but
Thank you.
I probably won't learn much about you. So lived experience is complete unmitigated nonsense, and there are
But
fields in philosophy and psychology that
but the woman that says I was abused and you say you want to know why she said that. How do you, I mean, that seems like a very difficult question as well to figure out why she told you that she was abused.
no, it's more of a statistical approach. Like if a woman keeps mentioning abuse, 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 I know almost for fact that she's preoccupied with this issue. That is a safe assumption, a safe thing to say.
Hmm.
But it is very unsafe to observe her, even in her natural environment, even her personal history, autobiographical memory, and so on.
Mm.
First of all, as we all know, memory is extremely unreliable. Starting with the studies of Elizabeth Loftus and later, we now know that memory is probably the most unreliable thing there is
Mm.
because we reconstruct memories all the time. Collective memory is the same.
Hmm.
Narratives change all the time. The black narrative of the 1960s is not the same as it is now. And the black narrative of the 1860s was not the same or definitely not the same as it is now,
Right.
and so on and so forth. So, if there is such a thing as black narrative, also these generalizations, like if you have a specific skin color, you have an identical experience to all people with the same skin color, is of course invalid. Exactly like white people don't have the same experience. We're both white. I doubt dramatically whether we have a lot in common, you know? Because I grew up in Israel, I was a member of a minority in Israel, I was abused by the collective. I mean, I dramatically different experiences to you. And we're both white. What's the fact? What your skin color has anything to do with anything?
You know, it's outrageous.
I'm perplexed. You know?
So I want to go back to this issue of the distinction between the fantasy and your distinction between between the vision and the fantasy. So because the and what the difference is, and whether the difference can be understood internally to the visions or whether it has to be understood by the consequences. We have another vision. The other vision says there's these things called nations. Everybody knows that they're arbitrary. They don't even follow geography that well. I mean, sometimes they do. You know, like the one between the United States and Mexico kind of does, but the one between the United States and Canada, it even goes through lakes, you know. So we know they're arbitrary, but we say we need that to be able to have a community. but we also say all humans have inalienable rights. So you get to a situation where you say all humans have inalienable rights, but we're only going to apply that to people inside these imaginary boundaries. And the left had basically been fine with that. In fact, you saw the left was in favor of reduced migration for a very long time because it depressed working class wages, and the left was on the side of the working class. And then over the last, 10 years or so, both in Europe and the United States, the left said, no, it's wrong, it's immoral to enforce these national boundaries because every human has these inalienable rights. Um, isn't what's going let's say, and if you object to the mass migration, let's just so isn't what's going on there a problem not of fantasy versus vision, but just the wrong fantasy?
No, I don't think. First of all, as to your first question, a vision calls for change. A fantasy calls for conservation and preservation.
Hmm.
A narcissist would not, for example, establish a shared fantasy with his intimate partner and would tell her, I want you to change me, or I want us to change something. A narcissist would establish a relationship with her in a shared fantasy so that she can affirm and confirm to him repeatedly that he is exactly the way he sees himself, immutably. So fantasies are immutable, whereas visions always have a call for action. The call for action could be founded on counterfactual pillars, could be founded on delusions, on imagination, on you name it. But there's always a dynamic aspect, whereas fantasies are always static.
Hmm.
That's the first thing.
Hmm.
What you have described is a third thing altogether, not fantasy and not vision, is these are narratives, stories. We are, we are, we are creatures, human beings are made of stories. People die for stories. You know, you have a piece of fabric with a stupid painting on it. People die for it. It's called a flag, you know. People die for totally fictional narratives like the nation state. And so we react very powerfully to stories. Frankl, it's not Sam Vaknin, it's Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl said that what keeps us alive is meaning, and that meaning is mediated via stories. You know, Bruno Bettelheim, when he analyzed fairy tales, enchantment through fairy tales, there's a big part dedicated to the power of stories. So these are narratives. Now, a narrative could be inclusionary. Marxism was an inclusionary narrative, or a narrative could be exclusionary. Only Americans. There's no rule that says that narratives have to be one way or the other. And you could start with an inclusionary narrative that becomes very fast exclusionary. So, for example, Marxism started off as inclusionary narrative as far as the proletariat, yes, inclusionary narrative.
Hmm.
But then communism became exclusionary in many ways. So, a nation state, the United States, I'm sorry if I'm offensive, is not a nation state by the 19th century definition of a nation state, by the work of Renan and similar scholars at the time. Um, is not a nation state because nation states in the 19th century were perceived as homogeneous, racially and ethnically homogeneous. And even if you were not homogeneous, you were supposed to expel the minorities or somehow suppress them, and so on. And there were huge transfers of population between Bulgaria and Turkey and Greece and, Czech Republic and Germany. I mean, people were transferring populations in order to homogenize the state, the nation state. And by this definition, the United States and most industrial countries nowadays are not nation states. What are they? They're narratives, reified narratives. That's what they are. And narratives, this kind of narratives, are about affiliation, about belonging. So these are in-group narratives. And Immediately when the narrative is an in-group narrative, it is also a negative narrative. There's an out-group. We call this process in psychology negative identity formation. When you grow up, you can say, I'm going to be like my father. That is positive identity formation. Or you can say, I am never, ever going to be like my father. That's negative identity formation. The narrative of what used to be nation states, now they are not nation states because they're mongrels, they're hybrids, they're multicultural, multi-ethnic societies, and it's a bloody mess. So there are no nation states anymore. So what replaced the nation state, the nation state is a narrative. And the narrative is built on positive identity formation. All Americans are entrepreneurial, there's social mobility, American dream. By the way, totally counterfactual. Upward social mobility in the United States is the lowest in the industrial world. And so you have positive aspects, but you also have negative aspects. Americans are not immigrants, and immigrants are not Americans, especially if they come illegally. They're undocumented. That's perfectly legitimate. It's a legitimate narrative. Actually, all narratives are both inclusionary, in-group, and exclusionary, out-group. All narratives have positive identity formation and negative identity formation. There's nothing special about it. And these narratives have nothing to do with vision. They're not visions, and they're not fantasies. They're just an agreement, what Jean-Jacques Rousseau called the social contract. They're just a contract, an agreement between a group of people to belong, like forming a club or, you belong. It's about belonging.
In the case of I want to on this issue also the distinction between a victimhood narrative and a non-victimhood narrative. Um, is what happened in the United States your view? Because of course the Declaration of Independence is this long complaint against the king.
Exactly, yes. It's a
It's
victim
very
narrative.
complaining. Yeah. But then after that, they say, so we're going to start a country that everybody has these inalienable rights, excluding obviously what was happening in the South with slavery. But the idea was we're all going to have these inalienable rights. And then we moved beyond it. And we did not have a story of the United States in a victimhood narrative. Um, is that sort of, and now I guess, so I have a lot of questions about it, but in your view, is that sort of one of the most crucial parts of it is to not have a victimhood narrative? And are there other nations that, I mean, do any nations have victimhood narratives? And then I guess the other question is sort of how do you get people out of them, nations and other people out of the victimhood narratives? Because it seems like yeah, if you, what's exciting about for me, this conversation is you can start with a victimhood narrative, but then you can also get out of it as the United States showed.
Absolutely. Actually, some visions are founded on victimhood, vision. So the incentive to change is to not be a victim anymore. Like they
Hmm.
start with a victimhood narrative. They say, okay, now we have a vision how to not be a victim. Zionism is an example.
Hmm.
Zionism was a victimhood narrative. Poor we, Holocaust, this, that, but we will never again. So it's a victimhood narrative that gave rise to a vision, a transformative vision. Vision is always about change. So transformative vision, which is Zionism, it became the state of Israel, and uh, it became a narrative. State of Israel is a narrative because people came from 140 countries. I'm a Sephardi Jew. Trust me, I had nothing whatsoever to do with Ashkenazi Jews, zero common denominator. And yet, we all became Israelis. We all served in the same army and so on and so forth. This was the overpowering narrative of belonging. So, affiliation narrative. It
Hmm.
started with victimhood narrative, became a vision, and led to an affiliation narrative.
Hmm.
This is a progression. Similarly, Germany. Germany had a victimhood narrative. The victimhood was Versailles, the Versailles Agreement after First World War. So there's a victimhood narrative, we were victimized with this, with that. Poor we. There was a vision. The vision was Nazism. The vision doesn't have to be positive, of course. The vision was Nazism. It was a revolutionary movement for change. The vision gave rise to an affiliation narrative, the super race and Aryan, this, that. There was affiliation narrative. Affiliation narrative had an inclusionary aspect and an exclusionary aspect that led to the Holocaust. And then it became a fantasy. At some point, the war went wrong. And at that point, Hitler transitioned to a fantasy. The
Mm,
minute Germany at that point, probably
mm,
1942,
mm,
when Hitler transitioned to fantasy, Nazi Germany was doomed.
mm,
When Nazi Germany collapsed, the modern Germany, especially West Germany, modern Germany, abstained from a victimhood narrative, did not have a victimhood narrative, and yet did have a vision, the vision that led ultimately to the European Union. So they did have a vision, this time a positive vision, which led to an affiliation narrative, which started off as West Germans, so unification of Germany, and then was expanded to the European Union. So, like now, the affiliation now, in the eyes of Germans mostly, is we are Europeans. Like there's a new affiliation narrative,
mm.
Europeans. And again, the affiliation narrative of being Europeans had an inclusionary aspect. We are Europeans. And the definition of European is very fluid, by the way. They're talking about Canada and Australia and Israel, and don't ask. So we have this fluid, we are Europeans affiliation narrative, but there was an exclusionary aspect, immigrants. And that gave rise to the right, to right-wing movements in Europe, ironically, the exclusionary aspect of the affiliation narrative. So this sequence is very common. Victimhood, vision, affiliation narrative, and then excluding someone. Negative formation, positive formation. Negative by excluding someone. This is a classical sequence, characterizes most of human history.
Now,
The
in the
only,
case of Germany,
yeah, East Germany.
there's this very strong narrative that Germany uh, was the oppressor, that the Germans are all still guilty from what they did. And and when there's a lot of evidence that that's been driving the Energiewende, the big transition to renewables. They say it. They say it openly. They say this will redeem Germany to the world. And the same thing with the mass migration. We're going to let in 1 million migrants because that will redeem us to the world. And it seems also pathological. Um, you could see it as being, I mean, obviously people that defend it see it as being generous and whatnot, but the pathological part appears to be this irrational view that the people alive today need to do things based on what Germans, different Germans, not because of course the children and the grandchildren.
It's not only Germans. There is, there is, if you wish, a reverse victimhood narrative, like we are the abusers.
Yes.
It's not Germany only. It's all the former colonial powers. It's not
The
limited.
United States,
United Kingdom, United
slavery,
States.
the slave. You
Uh,
get these singular evil events, slavery, indigenous genocide. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that let's just take the United States to just disentangle it from Germany, which is a more complicated case. These narratives show up not right after slavery, not right after indigenous genocide, but long past. Um, they start showing up in the 1960s, really from the 1960s all the way through this last, we call it the woke reign of terror, the last 12 years. Um, why, in your view, do these narratives? I'm sorry. What did you say? It's oppressor narratives. It's
yes,
that we were
a reverse victimhood. It's like
reverse victimhood narratives.
it could be either
Why do
victim
they?
or oppressor.
Yeah. Why do they show up when they show up, and not earlier when there's actually a much stronger memory that people are still alive who did the genocide and the slavery?
Europe. Notice the dates.
Hmm.
It's the 1960s. And no, this is not what I'm saying is not speculation. You can trace the intellectual provenance and the pedigree of all these ideas and so on and
Mm.
so forth. Many of these people actually studied in Europe, in Paris and so on. In the 1960s, there was a redefinition, realignment, moral realignment. It was the end of the colonial period. There was the emergence of post-colonial studies. There was institutionalized guilt and redemption and atonement via, variety of compensation schemes. And the Germans gave money to the Jews, the reparations. So it was not limited only to colonialism, but to all the vile and evil actions of the white race. Let's summarize it, you know. So whites everywhere, starting in Europe, adopted the view that they have misbehaved, or the misconduct was so egregious that they need to somehow, as the Germans put it, um, Gut Wiedermachung. They need to Gut Wiedermachung means to make it good again in German. Make it good again.
Redeem,
Yeah, redeem, but restore. It's more like restore.
restore.
Make it good
Yeah.
again.
Hmm.
And that was not only, Germany had it with the Jews and so on. Everyone had it with someone. Like everyone was, people were all over Africa, and it was all the ferment of the 60s, ferment of the 60s. The influence of this emanated from Europe.
Hmm.
There was the epicenter of all, but spread throughout the world. I mean, you had people in Africa, you had people in the Middle East, you had people who were heavily influenced by these intellectuals and intellectual thinking. In So it's not an accident that it happened in the 1960s of all decades. Why not in
Mm.
the 1990s? Well, in the 1940s,
Right.
1960s, because that's when the whole world entered this phase. You had in 1968, you had revolutions, attempted revolutions, student protests in well over 23 countries, from Canada to France, from Germany to United Kingdom,
Yeah.
so there
I
was.
mean, what's so striking is that it happens in because the United States, of course, after World War II, we're the heroes. I mean, we saved the world from fascism, and there was a period of that, certainly through the 50s. But yeah, you certainly get into the 60s, and it's suddenly the United States is just this evil, and you forgot everything that happened in World War II. It's just it's
The United States became evil a bit later. The United States was cast as the villain mainly in the 70s and 80s. Not exactly in the 60s. Actually, in
not
the
from
mid,
you don't think the Vietnam War cast the United States as as the
started
villain?
started that process.
Yeah.
So it took a few years for the mental
Hmm.
picture to change. In the
Right.
in the late 60s, you still find, for example, um, French students saying that the twin revolutions, they called it. The French
Hmm.
Revolution was influenced by the American Revolution. So, like, the good influence of America radiating all over the world, starting in the 18th century. You still have these voices in the late 60s. But
Hmm.
then, of course, by 1970, you know, the trend reversed and America became the villain. And then you had Vietnam, you had Pinochet in Chile, you had Iran, the coup in
Yeah.
Iran, so people started to say it's a new colonial power.
Um, Sam, I'm curious your view of where things are headed now. It's so the mood in the United States, it's just it couldn't be more different. I've never lived through a period where I can look back 6 months or really more like a year ago and go, wow, the the media used to in just a year ago, the media decided that Joe Biden couldn't be president or he couldn't run for re-election. He had to step down. The media decided that. Um, the media really ran the United States. Well, now here we are 12 months later, the two most powerful people in the United States and the people that we've been talking a lot about for good reason are Donald Trump and Elon Musk. Donald Trump, I think, inarguably more powerful just because he's the president, and when there's a disagreement, Trump wins. But Musk is incredibly powerful. Um, The left has not, there are not protests on climate change. There are not protests defending DEI. There are not protests on transgenderism. There's not protests demanding open borders. It's incredible. You know, when the Democrats, when Trump went to Congress to address Congress, I think it was February, the Democrats held up little signs. None of them were climate, trans, open borders, race. I mean, the four biggest things, you would say really the three biggest: race, climate, trans, with the borders sort of done sotto voce. But they weren't, the Democrats are not defending their program. They're sort of now they're burning Teslas but then Elon's gone and the left is it's hard to even know what the left is now.
You don't think it's a shock reaction? Delayed
Well, I'm curious your
post-traumatic
view.
stress?
I mean, so the question is, do we think the left will go back to those issues? I'm very skeptical because the part of it is that there's just the politics are terrible. You know, transgenderism is opposed. 71% of the public opposes trans medicine. 78% opposes trans people in sports. Climate change, we had the energy crisis, which is when we were first in touch. That was 2022. And now Greta Thunberg is on Palestine, and as you said, she'll be on something else.
Yeah.
And so climate's kind of gone. I mean, they shut down the main climate change study that they do in the United States, and there was hardly any protests. It's incredible. So I am curious your view. I don't think they're going to go back to that. I am curious your view because I think it's sort of it's a little bit like it is like somebody was living in a fantasy
Yes,
and then suddenly came back to
yes.
reality.
They crashed the same way the USSR crashed.
Mm,
Fantasies crash. End of
mm,
story. They're not
hmm
sustainable. And they alienate most people. And you wake up from fantasy, you're all alone, exactly like the narcissist. Narcissist wakes
mm,
up at the end of his life, he's all alone,
mm,
abandoned, you know.
mm.
So I think that there are few, um, if you want my input, I think
Yeah, this.
there are few things to. First of all, the Democrats lost their major constituencies. And they lost the major constituencies because they declared a culture war. What they failed to understand that there was no alignment between economic interests and cultural values. In other words, the working class is highly conservative. I mean, not all of it, but most of them are highly traditional, highly conservative, highly. And if you fight for the economic interests of the working class, you cannot afford to be progressive or woke, because that's not what the working class is. So the minute they adopted the woke movements and so on as a hobby horse, they have lost their constituencies. In this culture war, they've lost. And then they became the party of the elite, which is, there have been such reversals actually in the past in American history. Even if you look at the Republican Party antebellum, before the Civil War, and so on, there have been such transitions. It's not uncommon. It happened in American history. So now they're the party of the educated classes and the elites and so on and so forth. Maybe not the billionaires, but all educate in terms of education, the educated classes. And the question is, um, what can they come up with next that would mobilize and energize both these mutually exclusive constituencies? Because educated people hold the working class in contempt. I mean, it's between us. Don't tell anyone. They
Uh,
hold the working
it's,
classes in contempt.
they make it plain to see.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the working classes, to be frank, uh, regard the educated people as out of touch and derisively. So there's no love lost between these two constituencies. How can you establish a party on this hybrid ground?
Hmm.
I don't think it's possible. I therefore think the relevant question is the life expectancy of the Democratic Party, not what will be the next hobby horse. Or
Hmm.
I don't see a way for the Democratic Party to survive. And I think that's precisely the reason that they're demonizing Donald Trump
mm,
and trying to unite everyone
mm,
around the defense of democracy.
mm,
There's only one major problem with this. Democracy failed to work for the majority of the electorate in the United States, and not only in the United States. Democracy as a political system gave rise to intellectual oligarchy, elitism, and it failed as a political system. Um, at least the type of democracy we're having right now has failed as a political system.
mm.
And so the defense of democracy is an off-putting message. Because most people are disenchanted with democracy, including intellectuals, such as myself. I think democracy is a horrendous idea. In this sense, I'm an adherent of José Ortega y Gasset, the guy who wrote the famous book, Revolt of the Masses. I think democracy is a bad idea. And I think we need to come up with an alternative political arrangement or a way to make decisions and so on. But simpler people, less educated, less pretentious than me, they simply feel that democracy didn't work for them, didn't do the job. So the defense of democracy cannot be a rallying cry, will not recreate, reinvent on the fly the Democratic Party. And even I would say it's a mistake. I mean, they can gather around them disgruntled intellectuals and this kind of people, virtue signalers, covert narcissists, and this kind of. They can create a new victimhood movement. The democracy can be cast as the victim, and then there's a rescuer as savior, which is a Democratic Party, but that's a sliver of the American people.
Well, and also the problem is that under democracy, the public repudiated the Democratic Party.
Yes.
The Democrats tried to incarcerate their main political opponent. They engaged in mass censorship. I'll tell you another thing I wanted to ask about, Sam, is this revolt of men.
Just to finish my answer.
Oh yeah, sorry.
No, 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 not your fault. Uh, what I'm trying to say is that I think we should focus less on what would be the next narrative of the Democratic Party, what next cause of the Democrat, what the next type of activism. And I think we are faced with the distinct possibility of the total disintegration of this big tent of the Democratic Party. It has never been cohesive, never been coherent. It's a grievance-based movement, victimhood-based bullshit. I don't think it has survival value right now.
Mm,
I don't think it's contributing anything. And I don't think its defense of democracy sounds credible or worthwhile, honestly. So I think it's going to dissipate and disintegrate. That's my prediction.
mm,
And then these are dangerous waters because never mind how virtuous you are, when you're faced with the potential for total power, very few people can withstand this temptation. Even the Pope, you can't stand this temptation.
mm,
It's a vacuum, it's an opportunity. Nature abhors vacuum. There's an opportunity. I mean, then America, I think the real crisis in America is the imminent death of the Democratic Party, not the imminent death of democracy.
mm,
Once the Democratic Party is out of the picture as a meaningful force, then you would be faced with a one-party system.
mm.
And then, I don't know, maybe not Donald Trump, but someone else. It's very tempting, this vacuum, very dangerous.
I want to last question, and then I'll let you go, Sam. I'm curious your view of the reaction from men. You know, young men. You may know that the Generation Z voted disproportionately for Trump.
No, the men, mainly the men, yeah.
More of the men than women, but the women did actually increase as well. But the men are clearly in young. My son is 26. Um, the men are just have had it, and I'm curious your view of masculinity and manliness and the ways in which yeah, it was just been denied these fundamental sex differences. We've discovered there's a Harvard psychologist named Joyce Benenson who's written a book called Worriers and Warriors. And the research on the psychology of sex differences is incredible, and yet we've not been allowed to talk about it. Um, I wonder if you've thought about sort of how, manliness and masculinity have been sort of repressed and demonized. At the same time, when we interviewed Joyce, her career was, she was, ostracized. She's very liberal, but, ostracized. And I asked her, I was like, is it that your colleagues would say that there's no differences between women and men, or that women are good and men are bad? And she said they said both. Both things were going on. And now we see this revolt of men. I wonder how you see this the sort of really the repression of masculinity and manliness since the 60s and this new revolt of men.
It is an indisputable fact that whatever has happened until the 1950s was a men's doing. There were very, very few women who were involved, usually indirectly, and not very. The women were not very influential. So whatever has happened until the 1950s was men's doing. During the first two world wars, the first two, because there will be others, I assume, but during the two world wars, women got a chance to experience the male existence.
Mm,
And they discovered that it was a sleight of hand. It was kind of Wizard of Oz. That there was nothing much to it. They worked in factories, they manufactured weaponry and munitions, and they said, it's not such a big deal. Men were making too much of it. This experience, this exposure to the men's world, caused women essentially to become defiant and to adopt many psychopathic features.
mm,
Um, Another thing that has happened is that women began to describe themselves in stereotypical male masculine terms. These are studies by Lisa Wade and others. In 1980, there was a study that asked women to describe themselves using 9 adjectives, and they chose 8 stereotypically feminine adjectives like empathy, caring, loving, compassionate, this, that. Fast forward to 2020, women again were exposed to the same questionnaire and they were asked to describe themselves using 9 adjectives, and they chose 8 masculine adjectives:
wow.
ambitious, competitive, ruthless, callous, and so on. In my work, and I've done a lot of work on gender, and we could have a whole conversation, by the way, on gender issues. I'd love to.
Yeah, that sounds great.
It's difficult to find an intelligent interlocutor. So that was a compliment, by the way.
Thank you.
So, in my work, and again, it's very extensive, um, I propose the idea of unigender. I think what we're having emerging is a unigender world where we have women with vaginas and men with vaginas and men with penises. Everyone is actually masculine. It's exactly the opposite of the prevailing perception that everyone is effeminate or feminized, or that men were forced to feminize and women. What is happening is actually everyone is becoming a man. And here men are faced with a choice. If women had become men, then a man can become a man by exaggerating masculinity, and this is known as toxic masculinity, or a man can give up because women are winning. These are the statistics. 60% of university graduates are women. And no, it's not only in the humanities. It's already about 35% in STEM, science, technology, etc. Already 35%. Under the age of 25, women make more money than men across most countries that we know of. I mean, China, Egypt, Russia, these are global studies. Women are taking over. 1/3 of all households have a woman as a main provider, as a primary provider. The vast majority of children under a certain age, majority, not vast, majority of children under a certain age grow in single-parent households, and the parent is, in the vast majority of cases, a woman, a mother. Professions that used to be exclusive male domains are now completely dominated by women, starting with nurses. Nursing was a male profession. Teachers. Teaching was a male profession. Judges and attorneys and prosecutors, the legal professions. Judges are still, there's still a majority of men in the higher levels, but when you go down, there's a majority of women. Prosecutors, majority of women, and so on. So women have taken over. The real revolution is that the future is a matriarchy, not a patriarchy. And men are falling behind. And so some of them are becoming very aggressive, very violent, very toxic, they're
Right.
reactionary. They're trying to reverse the clock. There's misconstrual of traditionalism and conservatism, and
Hmm.
I would call them male supremacists.
Hmm.
But the overwhelming majority just gave up. We know,
Hmm.
for example, that among men, uh, the the main preoccupation is playing video games.
Hmm.
And that's not the case with women. It's only men. So men nowadays play between, depending on the country, 6 to 8 hours a day video game. That's escapism, of course. We know that depending on the country, 40 to 60% of people under the age of 35 continue to cohabit with their parents. They live with their parents.
Hmm.
But this is a very misleading statistics because strangely, majority of them are men, not women. We know that milestones and parameters of adulthood are deteriorating and declining all over. Frequency of sex, number of sexual partners, driving, drinking, firearms. These were hallmarks of masculinity. All of them completely collapsed. So, for example, most men in the United States postpone as much as they can getting a driving license.
Hmm.
The use of alcohol, the consumption of alcohol among men, especially among the young, has declined precipitously, and not because of health reasons.
Hmm.
So this myth that young men drink and it's wrong, it's counterfactual. And of course, we know that the frequency of sex is all but collapsed. My generation has had much more sex than Gen Z and a bigger number of sexual partners. There is an indication of avoiding life. We have a clinical term for this. It's called constriction. We have strong indications of constriction, avoidance, introversion, running away, withdrawing, only among men. It's a dysfunctional reaction, usually indicative of a threat. It is called the freeze response.
Hmm.
There's a freeze response. Men are perceiving women as a growing threat.
Hmm.
So on the face of it, you see, Roe versus Wade and the women in Afghanistan and women in Russia, where domestic violence has been decriminalized, and so on and so forth. And we see this backlash, this reactionary backlash by men. And we say it's over, feminism is over, we're going back to the 50s, 1950s. Nothing can be further from the truth. These are just dying convulsions of gender, men, who have failed and are failing to reassert themselves, and above all, to redefine themselves and to find a new identity. Men can't accept, can't make sense of a world where women are, may end up dominating. There's no paradigm there that has prepared them for that. And in addition to that, all the institutions collapsed. The parents as authority figures, society, the church, the family. I mean, it's all collapsed. So there are no guidelines. There are no what we call in clinical literature, there are no scripts, sexual scripts, social scripts.
Hmm.
There are no guidelines. And so YouTube became the great educator. Sex education is mostly from YouTube and peers, according to studies. And of course, you have figures like Andrew Tate and so on, who are father figures, substitute father figures, and so on. So the institutional collapse affected men disproportionately because institutional collapse favors women.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because these institutions were male-oriented. They were built by males, constructed by males, in favor of males, and so on. So when the institutions collapse, females, women benefit disproportionately and mightily, whereas men suffer. And the great irony, of course, is that what we call feminism, starting with the first wave, basic rights, voting, and so on, these were granted to women by men. I mean, there were suffragettes and all these. No one paid attention. They were clowns in the circus. The real reforms were carried almost 100% by men and for 100 years, including the contraception and you name it. These are all gifts given by men to women. And women are trying to usurp the place of men. I'm sorry to say that. They have declared war. It's a gender war. Women have declared war. Women have become misandrist. They're men haters. Where we complain about misogynism and so on. I've never heard more virulent speech than among women when it comes to men. So there's a war here.
Mm-hmm.
And men didn't wake up to this yet, I think. They're playing dead. Part of the problem, big part of the problem, they don't know how to be a man. No one
Mm-hmm.
taught them, no one instructed them,
Right.
no one knows how to be a man anymore.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to be a man? To be dominant in bed, on a one night stand, or to give flowers maybe, or what is it to be a man? And there's no guidelines, no nothing. It's mess. It's very fluid. But
Right.
women know what it is to be a woman. To be a woman is to be girl boss. To be a woman is to be the new man.
Right.
So there's a clear definition on what it is to be a woman nowadays and what is not allowed when you're a woman. You will not be submissive. You will not be, but there's no equally clear definition on what it is to be a man. And some women objectify themselves as a manipulative ploy. So there's the raunch culture, yeah? The raunch culture is kind of objectifying yourself, rendering yourself a sex object as a woman, but the idea is not to cater to the whims and needs of men or to conform to their stereotypes. No, although this may be the outcome. The idea is to manipulate them.
You're talking about OnlyFans.
OnlyFans and sugar daddies and there's a whole culture, giant culture, enormous culture. I mean, it would exceed your wildest beliefs and expectations of leveraging men's stupidity, gullibility,
Mm-hmm.
vulnerability,
Mm-hmm.
and so on to make money and to benefit, mainly monetarily, but not only, legally, of course, and so on.
Mm.
So the paradigm has reversed. The abused party nowadays are men, in my view. I am not denying at all that men had abused women egregiously over many, many centuries and maybe millennia. I'm not denying this at all. But right now, the pendulum has tilted, and I think women are abusing men. And I'm uniquely positioned as an observer because I'm in the abusive relationship space for 30 years. And with all undue modesty, I have contributed mightily to the field. A lot of the language in use today is mine. I invented it. So I don't feel that I
Helping.
need to be careful, and I don't feel
Yeah, yeah.
inferior in this when I say this. Definitely, women today are abusing men at a rate that easily competes with anything men have ever done to them before.
Mm.
Easily. I
What
have,
do you go ahead. No, I'm
I
just
mean, I
curious
have
what your
ideas. I have ideas on how to
what's your
overcome this
vision?
today. But what I would
Yeah.
like, yes, please. I'm
No,
sorry.
no, I was just saying what's the tell us the dream.
So what I would
What's
like
the
to
vision?
suggest is a third
Yeah.
conversation, if you're not averse to
Yeah,
it,
yeah. I'd love that.
dedicated only to this, gender,
Yeah.
masculinity, femininity. I have a lot to say about it, and I've said a lot,
Yeah.
but I think it's a fascinating topic. And again, I think I mean, people getting a few things wrong. I didn't have time now to mention them, but I think some things people are getting wrong. I want
Hmm.
to also to put it in a very long historical context,
Hmm.
because there is a historical context here, and even a religious intellectual context here, which is very often neglected in all this literature. Because most of the literature, because I've read all of it, and I had to, but most of the literature is very like operational, like how many one night stands and what men do to women, what women do to men is like kind of, I don't, I can't recall off the top of my mind a book, for example, who analyzed the intellectual traditions that have led to the state of things as it is today.
Hmm.
I can't, not a single book that I can remember. I read Simone de Beauvoir, I mean, you name it, I read all of them. Friedan, I mean, all of them, I read everything. But I didn't find an in-depth study of the intellectual traditions that led to this. And of course, these are extensions of processes that have lasted sometimes for millennia. You know, this is a culmination of something. It's the
Hmm.
tip of an iceberg. And I find it fascinating when you draw this line, when you show the progression, the inevitability of it all. I find it fascinating. And if men don't wake up, we're going to find ourselves in the position that women found themselves in after the agricultural revolution,
Hmm.
because it was the agricultural revolution that was the inflection point. And we're going to find ourselves in the same situation. And the oppression and suppression doesn't have to be overt or explicit, as you know. I mean, all these walk movements and so on, this oppression by other means,
Right. Right.
subtle, surreptitious, ambient, atmospheric,
Hmm.
the indirect social control, the abuse is hidden. It's like what we used to be called covert and overt text. Deconstruct. You need to deconstruct the abuse. And this is where we're going. I mean, no one will put men in prison, in gulags, or prevent men from going to work. I'm not talking about this kind of oppression, but the narrative itself can be oppressive. The
Hmm.
ethos can be oppressive. And I think that's
Right.
precisely where we're heading.
And it's also and because it's so invisible to people, it's
Yeah.
all the more powerful.
Yes. We call it the hidden text. The hidden
Hmm.
text is a lot more powerful. And that's why we have disciplines like deconstruction and so on, where we try to see the hidden text. Never mind
Hmm.
that it's been abused by the left, but okay. But still, I think it's a correct observation that every text has a kind of hidden text
Hmm.
underneath it. Definitely, ironically, in the writings of the left, there's a lot of hidden text.
Hmm.
Ironically, the right tends to be a lot more explicit.
Hmm.
Again, I am a liberal. Let it be clear. I'm not an advocate of the right. But the right is much more honest, much more direct, much more explicit. What you see is usually what you get, usually.
Hmm.
Whereas in the left, there are layers upon layers and the archaeology of the text. And feminism started off as neutral, but ended up definitely as an extension of this pernicious variant of the left.
Yes.
Insidious, actually, that's a correct word. Insidious version. So feminism, unfortunately, is utterly politically compromised and contaminated.
Yeah, it's a left-wing movement.
Definitely the third and fourth wave.
Yeah. Well, Sam, always a pleasure.
Yes.
I take it you're going to go on vacation?
No, no, no vacation. I'm preparing now for a 3-day seminar in Skopje that I'm giving. Uh, and then immediately after that, I'm participating in a documentary,
Oh,
German radio television. They're making documentary about my work and so on.
oh,
And so
great.
I need to prepare for this. But if you want to have a third conversation, we don't need to release these conversations, all of them at once. You can
Right, right.
keep them in reserve for
Yeah,
a
yeah.
rainy day. But if you want to have a third conversation, this week is actually great because I've emptied my calendar and I'm like,
Yeah, that sounds great. Let's do feminism. I mean, let's do feminism and
gender,
gender. That sounds lovely.
feminism, gender, sex, and so on. Yeah,
Yeah,
masculinity.
great.
Yeah. Okay. So
Good.
it's up to you. Initiative is yours.
Let's arrange over email.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for
Thanks,
having me
Sam.
again.
Always appreciate you.
My pleasure. Bye bye.
Bye.